Hi, everybody. Today is May 24th, 2026. I've been making these videos as a form of recovery from the trauma of watching my little brother Paul Cairns, 64 with Down syndrome, be locked away by the British Columbia New Democratic Party government, David Eby as leader, Nikki Sharma as Attorney General, and Sheila Malcolmson as the minister. They locked Paul away when I complained to the Burnaby RCMP after I discovered a secret and what I alleged to be a fraudulent and forged power of attorney the government created to give Paul the COVID-19 shot. The government appointed my then 82-year-old Catholic nun sister 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario as Paul's guardian. She had left home when Paul was born. She'd only met him a few times over the course of his 64 years. She'd never cared for him or provided anything for his maintenance, and she did not understand his speech or communication. So when I discovered this power of attorney, I applied to be Paul's guardian, to be what's called his committee in British Columbia, and the nun retained two law firms. She had an Ottawa law firm run by Charles Gibson, and Casey Deanshaw was her Vancouver lawyer with the firm Borden Ladner Gervais. When I complained to the police and the police discovered that the RCMP were going to do an investigation, they ordered the nun to do something, and what she did was she terminated my visits with Paul on the basis of by the authority of what I alleged to be a fraudulent and forged power of attorney. Now, I had cared for Paul since he was brought home from the hospital, and we had visited at will at that point for 64 years. I'd taken him to Newfoundland twice to visit our father. I'd taken him to Seattle. We visited the PNE. I had an agreement with the government that I could visit him twice a week, once at his group home, L'Arche, and once at my home. And I was his last surviving local family member and visitor. So by terminating his visits with me, the government eventually, if in effect, locked him away, locked Paul up. Eventually, they relented and they let us have a 10-minute telephone call once a week. And even then, they wouldn't let him come to the phone on many occasions. So I did everything I could think of. I was at that point a retired lawyer. I was a psychologist for the government of British Columbia working with mentally handicapped adults. My testing of mentally handicapped adults determined whether or not an adult was eligible for disability benefits. Then I went to law school as the first single mother to graduate from law school in British Columbia history. And after law school, I was a federal prosecutor. After becoming a federal prosecutor, I was hired by Carrie Lynn Finlay, who's now the front runner in the election for the Conservative Party of British Columbia, to be the next premier and the best premier of British Columbia. So she hired me, and then I went into family law. I practiced family law for 23 years until I was disabled in an accident. So I've been posting these videos as a way, or as a kind of treatment to recover from the trauma of watching Paul be locked away. And then when the nun found out, Paul had a stroke on April 15th of 2024. And then after that, I was allowed to visit him for 10 minutes a day at hospital at Burnaby General. I believe that the nun let me visit Paul at that point. I apologize. I'm in my happy place at Wendy's. So I did everything I could think of to try and restore Paul's visits, and I was not successful. I estimate that the nun spent $2 million on the Catholic Church spent $2 million supporting her fight to remain Paul's representative. She never moved Paul to be closer to her in Ontario, and she never moved to British Columbia. So as I said, Paul was locked away for 588 days, and then on April 15th or April 13th of 2024, Paul had a stroke, and I was allowed to visit him in person. They let me visit him in person at the hospital because by that point they believed the reason that they had locked him away was so that I couldn't get an authentic sample of his signature, because the signature on the document, the power of attorney, was a forgery. And I know that because I taught Paul to print the only word that he could ever read or print, his first name, Paul. It took me about a year as a little girl. I taught him Paul. And the signature on this forged and fraudulent power of attorney I could see was a forgery. So once Paul had a stroke, they believed that I couldn't get an authentic sample of his signature, so I was allowed to visit him. She only let me visit him. She didn't let me visit him at all until when she could see that he wasn't going to die, she flew in from Ontario, and then she let me visit him for 10 minutes a day. So I sat in the hallway outside of the ward that he was on for 10 to 12 hours every day. During that time, on April 21st of 2024, I got a phone call from a staff sergeant at the Burnaby RCMP. He told me that they had been ordered by their oversight agency in Ottawa to reopen the investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. I went to court the next morning and asked the judge to suspend the nun's guardianship over Paul pending the RCMP investigation, but we didn't get on. And when I got back to the hospital that day, so once the nun knew that I had been informed by the RCMP, she already had been informed by the RCMP that they had to reopen the investigation, but I didn't know until April 21st. And when she knew that I'd been contacted by the RCMP, Paul was dead within hours. He had been recovering remarkably well from the stroke. He sat up, he squeezed my hand so tightly when I said my name. He was so excited to see me, and grabbed a book from my hand and turned the pages perfectly, scanned the pictures perfectly. But when she found out that I had been contacted by the RCMP, I believe she ordered his treating doctor, Dr. Michael Baker, to kill Paul by sedating him to death. Paul had had a ventilator on throughout his stay at Burnaby Hospital after the stroke. They removed the ventilator with the oxygen mask. They took that away. So all medical supports were removed from him when I saw him after the nun found out I'd been contacted by the RCMP, and he appeared to me to be sedated to death. His eyes were wide open and unfocused, and his hand was completely still. And I got an email from the nun after that saying that Paul was dead, but that I could come and look at his body. So I believe they did medical assistance in dying on him, that they sedated him. They gave him a lethal injection and killed him. I asked the RCMP to treat Paul's death as suspicious, but I've never heard back from them regarding either the fraudulent forged power of attorney or my allegation that Paul had been killed unlawfully. In Canada, the law as it stands now, after a decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in February 2015, is that a doctor or a nurse, any doctor or any nurse, can kill anyone, but they have to be an adult and they have to be mentally capable. Paul had been through all of the litigation that we went through. Paul had a certificate that said that he was designated not capable. So Paul could never have consented to being killed as he was by Dr. Michael Baker and by my sister. So after Paul had died, as I was slowly recovering from his death, I started looking at the law of euthanasia in Canada and trying to understand what had happened. When I went to law school, what is now considered euthanasia would have been first-degree murder. So that's I went to law school between 1988 and 1991 for 3 years. Would be premeditated murder. So administering a lethal injection to anyone would, as they do now, would be considered first-degree murder. And after Paul was killed, I started looking into euthanasia in Canada, and I realized that what had happened in February of 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously and anonymously, so normally, this is important, it's a little bit technical, but please bear with me. Unanimously and anonymously, the Supreme Court of Canada reversed their earlier decision in a case called Sue Rodriguez, where they had said that it was against public policy and the public interest to allow doctors and nurses to do mercy killing or to do euthanasia on people. They reversed that decision with regards to a woman named Kay Carter, in a decision called Canada and Carter. This woman was already dead. She had been long dead. She had gone to Switzerland and been killed by a doctor there. But the reasoning was this. They said it wasn't fair to Kay Carter to make her wait until she was terminally ill, at which point she might not be able to commit suicide. That anyone could commit suicide, and it wasn't a crime in Canada, but this person, Kay Carter, who had spinal fusion, could not commit suicide, or by the time she was terminally ill, she might not be able to commit suicide. Therefore, they said doctors and nurses should be able to kill people. They gave Canada 12 months, that's 1 year. So they gave the Canadian government 1 year to develop a system of guardrails or a system for killing people that would not result in the illegal or unlawful killing of people who did not consent to being killed or did not meet the criterion. Even though in the history of the world, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, we always knew how to kill people, and quickly and painlessly too, but it was never, even Neanderthals and early 40,000 years ago, human beings did not kill their sick and dying members of society. And we know that because Margaret Mead, probably the most famous anthropologist, said that there are human skulls that show signs of healing after the person was catastrophically injured, which meant that someone must have cared for that person. Since what I find was shocking to me is that the architect of this scheme, a judge named Beverly McLaughlin, who I met her at a Women in the Law conference in 1991. Beverly McLaughlin, who went right after this decision in 2018, went on salary with the Communist Party of China in Hong Kong, and she became a Court of Appeal judge in Hong Kong for 6 years, from 2018 till 2024. Now, in Hong Kong, she didn't change the law so that the government could kill ill and dying members of society. It's still a capital offense in Hong Kong, punishable by death. So since she made that decision, the Canadian government has killed more than 100. Well, by Canada Day, July 1st of 2026, Canada will have executed extrajudicially. The protocol is any two medical practitioners, so any combination of any doctor or any nurse, sign a piece of paper. There's no sworn evidence, no affidavit. They sign a piece of paper along with the person they're going to kill. At this point, the person is required to be mentally competent, and they can't just be dying of a mental illness. It has to be, or they can't just suffer. They don't have to be dying at all. They just have to suffer from an ailment that is uncomfortable, irremediable. and they don't need to have a reasonable prospect of death at all. So the types of people that these doctors and nurses kill has exploded. And by June 1st of 2026, Canada will have executed extrajudicially by lethal injection. The way they kill them is they administer a lethal injection, and this may be what they did with my brother Paul. They administer a lethal injection that paralyzes the person, so the person can't call out, can't complain, can't change their mind, and they drown in their own lung fluids. There are numerous reports of people changing their mind but being killed anyways. So there was a woman who one of the witnesses said that he didn't believe that she had consented to being killed, that she was pressured by her husband. So he withdrew as a witness, and they just went and found a different witness and killed her anyways. Last year, a woman in Vancouver, an 84-year-old woman with a sore back, went to the Vancouver General Emergency, where I've been many times. I've taken my children there, and they didn't even ask her what was wrong with her. They just, a young female physician, doctor, walked up to her and said, "We've decided to offer you MAID." Now, the Canadian government, in all its cruel wisdom, has come up with this quick propaganda shorthand word, MAID, which makes it sound like the angel of death, a young maid comes down from heaven and releases you from your suffering. When the word, and that stands for medical assistance in dying, when the word medical itself has never, in the history of human civilization, has never been understood to mean killing someone. And the reason is because it comes from the Greek word to heal, and no one is healed by being killed. The basic argument against this scheme, this euthanasia, or I just call it extrajudicial, because there's no judge involved, no judge. The normal protections that we've had in Western society, in our common law system since 1215. So for more than 800 years, the system we have is if the state is going to deprive someone of life, liberty, or security of the person, a judge and jury has to be involved. There's no judge involved at all. All it is the decision of any combination of any two doctors, a doctor and a nurse, or two doctors or two nurses. So they make the decision. So there's no legal oversight of this scheme whatsoever. And Canada has exploded. It's by far, it will have killed 100,000 innocent, vulnerable people by lethal injection by Canada Day 2026. The rest of the world is horrified. Of the 196 recognized jurisdictions or countries in the world, there's only 4 that allow euthanasia, and that is Switzerland, the Netherlands, Spain, and Canada. But Canada is by far the most prolific killer of what are innocent, vulnerable, and usually inconvenient people. So I just wanted to say, I should have said this at the beginning, but today, May 24th, has special significance for me because it is the 32nd anniversary of my being hired by Carrie Lynn Finlay and going into family law. And I remember that day so clearly. I'd finished my internship with the Federal Department of Justice, and I had 2 kids to support, and I couldn't find a job as a lawyer. I was just struggling. I was a 34-year-old mature student, and Carrie Lynn Finlay hired me as a family lawyer, and that became my profession for the next 23 years. The other thing is that it's the 85th anniversary of 85 years ago, my parents, Mary Mulligan and Tom Cairns, got married. and in Sudbury, Ontario, and then they had 9 kids. I'm the 8th of 9 children, and it must have been a wonderful day. It was my dad. Even after my parents got divorced after they had been married for about 37 years. But even at the very end, my dad always he would ask me on this day, he said, "You know what today is? Today is the anniversary of our wedding." It always was a big thing to him. So I'm just going to wrap this up. I just want to give you an argument. People are going to, I'll tell you, Stephen King, I was just reading an article about Stephen King this morning. Stephen King said, "Murder is like potato chips. You can't stop with just one." The Canadian government has gone hog wild in this killing scheme. They just can't kill people fast enough or lower their standards. The Supreme Court of Canada, as I said, gave them 12 months to come up with a system, and then they had to review that system, which they have never done. And when you talk with people who promote this, they are like any crazy silly, like exactly like Ted Bundy. Unfortunately, I was trained as a psychologist and practiced as a psychologist before I became a lawyer. So the concept and the motivation of people for what they do is very, I look for it in everything. And these people, they really like killing people. There's like Ted Bundy. You ask, well, why did Ted Bundy kill all those women? Why did Willie Picton kill all those women? Because they like to. It's an addiction. They like the high that they get. And the Canadian government likes the power. But I'll tell you one thing that I've noticed is that Donald Trump has gone silent on making Canada the 51st state. But when people go silent is when you got to worry. He hasn't mentioned it for a couple of years. And without a doubt, I guarantee you that Donald Trump is contemplating invading Canada. That all of the top podcasters, and I listen to them, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, have both said, and Tucker Carlson, they've all said that Canada should be invaded because of its ghoulish euthanasia scheme, which is exactly what Hitler did before World War II. Before World War II, Hitler gassed all the dying, elderly, and disabled people in all the hospitals in Germany and Austria. And people at that time didn't complain. I guess they thought, oh, this is the modern way. And it's the same thing in Canada. When you talk about this, people's eyes glaze over and they think, oh, well, this is the modern way. It's like abortion or whatever. We're used to it. Well, I'll tell you what is different from abortion. I'm not pro-abortion, but fetuses in the history of humanity have never been considered persons, and they're dependent on the mother for survival. That's not the case with the people that Canada is now killing. The 100,000 people, they were persons within the meaning of the law as we've known the law since Roman times. Once a fetus takes its first breath outside the womb, it becomes a person. And the entities that the Canadian government has been killing at the rate, Canada's going to kill 45 people today. 5 out of every 100, the cause of death in 5 out in 5 out of 100 deaths in Canada is by euthanasia, and in Quebec, where they're really gone crazy with this, it's 7.5. And now the coroners have said that they're not allowed to say that it was a lethal injection that killed these people. It's whatever condition they had that they were complaining of. So our statistics for death are going to be completely skewed up. So I want to give you a brief argument to think about when you're discussing this, when you're contemplating it in your own mind. Any system that intentionally ends a human life is unacceptable because it risks irreversible mistakes and harm to vulnerable people. So the 3 points that I try and make when I'm arguing against euthanasia is that, number one, you cannot give informed consent to euthanasia because we don't know what death is. So you can give informed consent to having breast augmentation or to having your new hip replacement because you have some parameters of you know what's going to happen to you. But we have never known what death is. Some people in my religion, in Catholicism, we believe the good people go to heaven. Good people who have received the sacraments will go to heaven. The bad people will go to hell forever. And people who are good but have not received the sacraments go to purgatory. And consenting to euthanasia in itself is a mortal sin that condemns you to death forever in my religion. Many people believe that all that death is that you cease to exist as an entity. But probably the most common belief about what death is in the world is reincarnation, that you come back as another animal or as another person. But we don't know. We don't know what it is. And we have never known, and that's why we cannot give informed consent to being killed. Secondly, we stopped capital punishment. We stopped hanging in Canada because it's irreversible and people make mistakes. So most decisions that we make can be modified or reversed, but the one that most certainly we cannot change is death. So 1962 was the last capital punishment in Canada. 2 men were hanged on the same day in Toronto for murder. And I would have been 6 years old in 1962. And my grandfather was still alive in 1962. He was a lawyer, and then he was a judge, an Ontario Superior Court judge. And he lost 2 of his clients to hanging. He had an Indigenous man was hanged, one of his clients, and another man who was an immigrant from Sweden who did not speak English very well. Classic marginalized people killed by the state, and it was devastating for my grandfather. That was 1962, and that was the last time Canada executed people, and they had the benefit of a judge and jury and of the 800 years of the British legal system. These people that Canada's killing now do not have the benefit of any of that. In 1976, hanging was abolished for the reasons that I've just said, which is people make mistakes and it's irreversible. So it was abolished in civil contexts for people who are not in the military. And then finally, in September of 1999, only 26 years ago, Canada abolished military capital punishment, so hanging for treason or military crimes. So that was only 26. Canada only went 15 years without killing people. And now it's killing people at the rate of 45 every single day. The reasoning or the argument you can give people is, number one, no one can give informed consent to being killed. Number two, it's irreversible. We've abolished capital punishment for crimes because it's irreversible and people make mistakes. And finally, the third argument is this false implementation. So the Supreme Court of Canada made this ridiculous condition on allowing euthanasia in Canada by saying that Canada had to create guardrails so that nobody that was could be killed against their will and to keep the system in check. But that's ridiculous. because you can't do it. If it could have been done, if it was possible to kill only people that consented and for whom it was somehow a good idea to be killed, we would have been doing it for the last 40,000 years. But it can't be done because of all the motivations that people have. For example, in Canada, many of these people that are killed, their bodies are harvested for organs. So what I believe has happened is that I believe that the Communist Party of China, and with its infiltration of Canadian political systems, has taken over, and the people that it's killing are Canadian-born white citizens, 96%, and mostly female. And I believe that it is something that they don't, although in the Cultural Revolution of China, when it switched to communism, 100 million, they were very good at killing people then. They killed 100 million people, more than Hitler ever did. But it's still currently, and they've killed political prisoners and harvested their organs. And I believe that the euthanasia in Canada is directly related to the communist Chinese. It's not a Canadian philosophy or principle or moral ground that has ever existed. So we, in our British system of law, we've not killed elderly and dying people or disabled people for 800 years. And everyone has due process of law, and none of that is applying now. So that's all I can tell you for now. I love you all. Please go out there and remember, no one can give informed, you're not silly to oppose this. No one can give informed consent to being killed because we don't know what death is. It's a simple rational, but that's true. It's irreversible, and it's impossible to create a safety system or a guardrail that will protect already marginalized people. I love you all. Take care.